now that we have prepared our book pages and our cover, we're ready to put everything together. So this is the part where we learn the sewing technique. Let's make sure we have everything we need. So you'll need some kind of thread. I am going to use this waxed linen bookbinding thread. I got this on the website Hollanders, and this is just linen thread that already has wax on it. So the wax makes it a little bit more slick, so it'll kind of glide through better when we're sewing. When we're all done, the wax helps the thread stick together. Then I also have a spool of plain linen bookbinding thread. So this is just unwaxed basic bookbinding thread that's also linen. This can be used unwaxed or you can wax it yourself. For Coptic binding, I do like to use a waxed thread, and you don't need it to be very heavily waxed, but if you're starting with something like this that doesn't have any wax, you can take a piece of beeswax. You can use other types of wax as well. And then you're going to cut off the length of thread that you need and then just run it through the wax a few times. So we have that option. And then I also have some other types of thread that are not for bookbinding. So this is a thread that's made for leather working. It's a really strong type of thread. I like using it for bookbinding, and I've used it for Coptic bound books and it works really well. And then there's also dental floss, like good old natural fiber dental floss works great as well. And this already has wax on it. So this would also be a good option if you are in a pinch and you can't find good quality heavy duty thread. And then we're going to need a needle. You can either use a straight sewing needle. This is a bookbinding needle. A heavy duty sewing needle would work as well. You can also use a curved needle. Curved needles are really great for Coptic binding. As you'll see very soon, the sewing involves a lot of like looping of thread. We're going to be doing a stitch called a chain stitch, and the curved needle will make that a little bit easier on you. I ordered this one from Tallis. And then a pair of scissors to cut your thread would be great. And then of course our cover and our book block. I have my two covers that have holes punched along one edge that correspond to the sewing stations that I created in my signatures. And I have my 5 signatures, and I've put them together, making sure that the sewing stations align on all of the signatures. So I'm sure that they're all in the correct orientation right now. And so once you have all that stuff gathered up, let's get started. So I like to start with a length of thread that is about as long as both of my arms stretched out. So we can call that a wingspan. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut myself a wingspan's worth of thread. And the reason why I like starting with that much thread is that it is easy enough to handle. So it's not going to be too long. I'm not going to spend an unrealistic amount of time like having to pull my thread through every time I come through. And of course it's enough thread to possibly get completely through my entire book without having to join a new piece on. And if we do have to join a new piece on, there's a way to do that. And I'm going to start off with my straight needle. I'll do a bit of the demonstration with my straight needle and some with the curved needle so you can see the difference in how those work. Before I start sewing, I also have a little trick to lock my thread onto my needle. So I've threaded the needle. I'm going to just take the point of my needle and the short tail of my thread, and I'm just going to like stab the point of the needle through the thread. So I'm just kind of like splitting the thread with my needle. So you can see there how the point is coming in between the twines of the thread. And then just slide that down to the eye. And now I'm pulling on the longer part of the thread. And I'm just going to pull that tight so that there isn't a loop there anymore. And that kind of will like lock the thread in place so it won't fall off easily. So I like to have all of my signatures and my covers neatly ready to go ahead of my work area, and then I can just kind of take one at a time as I need it. So we're just going to start with one of the covers and one of the signatures. And we're just going to start by bringing our needle through the first sewing station, and you can start from either end of the book. I just always like starting from the right side, maybe because I'm right-handed. So if it feels more comfortable for you to start over here at the left, that's fine. I'm gonna pull my needle and my thread through, and I'm starting on the inside of the signature and pulling my thread to the outside. And I'm just gonna leave like a generous tail on the inside here. I don't have a knot tied in the end of my thread. I'm just gonna leave a tail. And now I'm gonna hold my first signature, and then I'm gonna bring my cover into the mix, and I'm gonna put my needle through the corresponding cover station, and I like going from the top to the bottom. I'm pulling my thread through until the cover meets up with the first sewing station, so that's what it should look like. And then I'm just going to take my needle and re-enter the same sewing station on my first signature. So I have my little tail of thread here as well as my main sewing thread. You can tug on both of those to tighten, so on the outside you won't see a loop or a lot of slack in the thread. And then I'm just going to tie those together in a knot, and that's what's going to secure my thread together. So rather than make a knot in the tail end of my thread, I kind of like doing this a little bit better. So I'm just tying a double knot. Okay, and then you can even cut the short tail so it doesn't get in your way. Okay, and now I'm just gonna go back out the next sewing station. So we're gonna work our way down the length of the cover and the first sewing station until we have attached the cover. And so again, just like the first one, I'm going to put my needle in from the top to the bottom of my cover. And then I'm going to bring the needle back through the same sewing station. And I'm just going to keep repeating that until I have sewn all of the sewing stations. When you get to the last sewing station on your cover, we're just going to go through the cover in the same way, but we're not going to bring our thread back into the signature. So you're just going to end up right here on the outside of the book with the thread coming out between the cover and the signature. And now we're going to move on to adding the second signature. So I've changed my camera angle because I think that will be a better view for the rest of the sewing. For continuing to sew, I'm going to keep my book flat on the table with the cover on the bottom towards the table, and then I'm going to be taking signatures and placing them on top each time I finish one. So we're ready to put the second signature in place. So I'm just going to take from my pile of signatures and I'm going to place the next one right on top of the first. And I'm just going to double check that the sewing stations line up. Now I'm going to work in a way where with one hand, so for me with my left hand, I'm kind of using that to hold the signature like half open, and then I'll be sewing with my right hand. So to attach the second signature, we're just going to take the needle, and remember we ended up at the last sewing station of the cover with the thread on the outside of the book coming out from between the cover and the signature. So I'm going to take my needle and just put it directly into the sewing station that is above that on my second signature. And I'm going to pull that through to the inside of the book. And now I'm going to come out to the next sewing station. And now we're going to start our chain stitching. So the chain stitching is like a loop that we're going to make around the thread that joins, in this case, the cover and the first signature. And this is what's going to create that braided stitch that Coptic binding is kind of known for. So I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to bring it in between the cover and the first signature, and I'm going in from the left of this thread that's right under where my thread is coming out of my signature, and I'm going to bring it through there. And now with my straight needle, I'm going to have to lift the pages of my book and I'm going to pull it through. So I'm pulling my thread through towards the back of my book. And then I'm going to bring it back out on the right side of that thread. And so that has just formed a loop that goes around this thread here. And now I'm going to bring my needle back into the same sewing station. And I'm going to pull that tight. You want to tighten gently, but of course you want to make sure that you're not leaving a lot of slack in the thread. So you don't want to have any like big loops of thread remaining on the outside or the inside. So anytime that you're tightening your thread, you want to make sure that you're tugging in a direction that's parallel to the spine, so that will actually tighten any slack that's, for instance, in this part of the thread over here. And I'm pulling it in a direction that's the same direction that I'm sewing in. So I'm sewing here from right to left, and so I'm pulling my thread to the left to tighten. We want to pull parallel to the spine because that helps the thread slide through really nicely. But if I pulled it towards me or if I pulled it backwards, that would run the risk of tearing the paper. So it could even tear from like one sewing station to the other, and then this signature would just be unusable. And I would have to take this signature out and either make another signature or just have one less signature in my book. But you do want to make sure that you're tightening as you go, because if you leave any slack in the thread and then don't deal with it until you're all the way over here on the left side, you've already sewn like 5 of these sewing stations, then it's going to be really difficult to tighten your thread enough to remove the slack that's all the way over here on the right side. So now we're just going to take the needle and bring it out through the next sewing station. So I'm coming back to the outside of the book. And again, the same thing for our chain stitch. I'm going to take my needle, I'm going to bring it in between the cover and my first signature to the left side of that thread that's joining the two together. So I'm going to insert my needle there. I'm going to pull it through into the space between the cover and the first signature. And then I'm going to bring it back out on the left side of that thread. And then I'm going to bring my needle back through the same sewing station that I came out of in the second signature. So I'm going to sew the next sewing stations in the same way until I get to the last one. get to the last sewing station, I'm going to do a kettle stitch, which is kind of like making a knot, and it's going to help hold our signatures together on either end of our book. We started in a very similar way to the chain stitch. So I'm going to put my needle in and loop it around the thread in the same way. And this time I did start from the left to the right. I usually do the kettle stitch starting at the inside middle of the book and then looping to the outside. So I'm going to pull that until it's not quite all the way tight. I'm going to leave a little loop here, and then I'm going to put my needle through the loop, and I like going from the bottom to the top. So I'm going to bring my needle through the loop, and we're just going to pull it straight up until it's tightened and it has formed a little knot right here. And now we're ready to put the third signature on. So for the third signature, I think I am going to switch to my curved needle so you can see how that works differently. So because I'm using my curved needle, I can start using a weight to help hold my pages down. You can't really do that with the straight needle because you kind of need to like flip your pages back and forth a little bit more to allow for the looping to happen with the straight needle. So I've put my new signature on top. I'm again checking to make sure that all of my sewing stations line up, and I'm going to make sure that I'm keeping this right to the edge of the table because that'll make it easier to work on than if it's further in. Now I'm just taking a weight, and I'm just using a rock. You can use any sort of weight that won't get your paper dirty and is heavy enough to hold things in place. And I'm just going to place my rock weight on the inside of my signature. And that's going to help hold my pages in place while I'm sewing. If it isn't working for you, don't use it, but it's an optional thing that you can try. Okay, so now I'm going to bring my needle again just right into the first sewing station. And then I'm going to come out the next sewing station. I'm going to pull my thread tight, and I'm going to continue doing the chain stitch. This time, we're going to go around the thread that connects the first and second signatures. The first chain stitch that we did, we were looping from the left to the right, and now I'm going to loop from the right to the left. So I'm going to put my needle in to the right side of that thread that joins the two signatures together, right there. And then I'm going to loop it around that thread so that it comes out on the left side. And so you can see the advantage of using the curved needle is that you just have to kind of turn it around in a circle, and it'll do that loop for you really easily. And then I'm going to pull that tight, and I'm just going to bring my needle back through the same sewing station that I came out of. So again, coming out of my sewing station, I'm going to insert my needle on the right side of the thread that's joining the first and second signatures. Loop around so that my needle point comes out on the left side of that thread. And then I'm going to pull that thread tight so that it creates the chain. And then I'm going to bring my needle back through the same sewing station where I came out in my top signature and pull it tight. So now you can already start to see that braided pattern starting to happen here. So with each signature, that will grow. So now I'm going to sew the remaining sewing stations in that method. again, when you get to the last sewing station, we're going to do a kettle stitch again. And so the kettle stitch, one more time, is like making a knot, and we're going to take the needle and loop it around that thread as if we were starting a chain stitch. But then instead of pulling it tight, we're going to leave a little loop, put the needle from bottom to top, coming from underneath, pull that thread through, and then just pull that tight in place. And now we're going to join the fourth signature. And this is pretty much the same. So just remember, at the end of each signature, you're going to do a kettle stitch. And when you start doing your chain stitches, you're going to alternate the direction from the previous signature. When I sewed the last signature in place, I did my chain stitches from right to left. And so on this signature, I'm going to do my chain stitches from left to right. You want to alternate it. That will keep your braided pattern looking really neat. Okay, so you can continue sewing your remaining signatures in place until you're ready to put the cover on. Going to attach this cover to our book in the same way. So I have my thread right now coming out of my last signature just after I did the kettle stitch, and I'm going to take my needle, just bring it through the first sewing station on the cover, from the top of the cover to the bottom. And then I'm going to bring my needle to the inside of my signature. And so with this method of Coptic, we're going to end up having 2 rows of thread on the inside. So we have the thread running there already. That is the thread that's holding the last signature on. And now we're going to be making a new length of thread that's holding our cover onto the book. So now I'm going to just come out the next sewing station. And again, I'm just going to loop my needle through the cover station and bring it back inside the book through the same sewing station where I came out. And I'm going to continue in this way until I get to my last sewing station. Now at the very last sewing station of the whole book, you will bring your needle into the last sewing station of the signature. We're going to just tie a knot. I like to loop the needle underneath this length of thread that's going from sewing station to sewing station. So I just bring the needle under there and create this loop, and then I'll bring my needle through to make a knot, and then I'll just do that one more time to make like a double knot, and that should secure everything in place. And you can cut your extra thread, and there is your beautiful Coptic bound book. Great job, everyone. Okay, so something you might be wondering about is what happens if you run out of thread during the sewing process?